Dr. Michael Munnik, a lecturer in social science theories and methods with the Centre for Study of Islam in the UK at Cardiff University. He is a sociologist of media and religion, and his work concerns the engagement of Muslims in Britain with news media. He's going to talk to us about his papers entitled To Suffer, To Help, To Blame, News Themes on Muslims in the UK during COVID. Over to you, Michael. Everybody else, if you can please mute yourselves and put your videos off, and questions can come through continuously in the chat box. Michael, hopefully that works. It's still a blank screen and we're on. Thank you. That's perfect.
Great. Thank you. Everyone seeing that okay as it should?
Yes, it's clear.
Excellent. And thank you, Gary, for inviting me. Thank you for Surya for the introduction. Thanks also, Ibrahim, for the previous paper. Really fertile, lots to look in that, and I'm really excited to see where you go with the research project. I've got questions, but I'll save that for the session afterwards. So the paper that I presented here, I actually did a little bit of a nasty and swapped my order of words around from the title that I had submitted and that Surya had read out, because I found that I was putting it together. There's a poetry to suffer, to help, to blame that I felt worked orally, but actually the right way to make the material come through is to begin with blame, then go to suffering, and finish with help. So apologies for the slight shift of things, but we shouldn't. The content's still certainly all there. Just a brief mention about me. I work, as mentioned, with the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, so just down the road from Lampeter, relatively speaking. Certainly it's a lot closer than Chicago or from Malaysia, but here at Cardiff University. And my contact details are there if you want to reach me afterwards. So I'll just begin with a couple of broad ideas. A disclaimer on this paper that this isn't the result of a robust, rigorous research project right now. So it's thinking about themes that we already understand about news coverage of Muslims in the UK media, and seeing how they relate in, I would say, still a pretty ad hoc kind of way with the media coverage. But in looking into this and developing this abstract in this paper, I think there's stuff that we could certainly dig further into, and this may be one frame of viewing and understanding that, although hopefully open to as we dig into material, more ideas may emerge. So I want to talk about, just to briefly think about what I discussed in the abstract about pack journalism, and then also the themes regarding it. This quotation comes from Russell Frank in a paper from a few years ago, talking about pack journalism. And he states the idea of it really well, that the herd is the enemy of the scoop. What one member of the herd has, all will have. And what he's getting at with that idea is something that the scoop is seen as this journalistic, really important prize. The thing we're all moving towards is the story that nobody else has, so that you get to really enterprise something and be seen as agenda setters. And you think about, the clear examples, if you're familiar with the film All the President's Men, that the work that the Washington Post did to break the scoop about Watergate is kind of the classic example of that. And so the herd is put in opposition to that. This is where all the journalists are kind of working together and building stories. And if you are a consumer of news, you may feel that there is a certain similarity that you see. That the stories don't show that individuality all the time, that material that appears in one newspaper, one news television broadcast is appearing on the others. And that gets to kind of the other side of his quotation immediately following from that. He says, separate yourself from the herd, and you risk missing what everyone else has. So there's the risk of the scoop in that pursuing a story that is original means you're not getting what others have. And so there's this worry about the perception that is there. You want to be perceived as enterprising, but also you don't want to be seen as out of step or missing something that someone else may see as important. If someone has a scoop and you don't have it, you are somehow deficient as a journalist. This is the contortions that work in the heads of journalists and editors. And the quotation from Frank continues, editors, and he's singling specifically the people who have more control over assignment and the publication, what actually ends up in the published version of these news products. Editors become nervous about printing what other papers do not have, and about not printing what the other papers do have. So there's this sort of idea of a stultifying effect on news enterprise and originality. So we marry that problem of the scoop versus the herd with what we already understand. And this slide this is the subject of an entire lecture for my students at Cardiff, but I'll summarize it just briefly here. And it probably wouldn't be surprising to people on a conference like this that when we look at the content studies of representation of Muslims in the news media, we get the idea that Muslims are pitched as a threat to Western civilization. And these are some studies that looked at things even pre 9/11, but I do see 9/11 as being a watershed event, not only in the United States, but also in British news and I think globally. So the idea of the threat persists, and this comes right from people like Edward Said and then understood by folk like Elizabeth Poole looking at the UK media. There is an exaggerated association of Muslims with conflict, and there's a very thorough study done by scholars at the University of Lancashire and Edge Hill here in UK looking at British news media both just before 9/11 and then the years following that make a very clear case that there's something exceptional going on in terms of fusing Islam with conflict and problems. And then as we move away from the sort of hot button ideas of terrorism to this idea of British values, that there's a lack of fit with British values, that there's something sort of that othering that's going on. So referencing some papers that look at that in some more detail. So this is the story that you might say is the herd's story regarding Muslims in the news media, the one that will surface a lot and looks pretty replicable across the different platforms. So just as I say, we see these themes in the coverage, we'll also see this then when COVID-19 comes around, and if there are stories that look into Muslims, they seem to fit certain patterns in terms of how they're being discussed. I also just want to briefly think about a frame that occurred to me that comes across this, the idea of the drama triangle, which you may be aware of. Stephen Karpman came up with this in psychotherapy back in the 1960s. I was introduced to this in a media study through Lisa Bruton, who was looking at coverage of human rights NGO journalism, as well as NGO activity in Myanmar or Burma specifically, where she used the idea of sort of savage, victim, and savior. But we see persecutor, victim, rescuer in Cartman's drama triangle model. And we can think about the blame, the suffer, and the help in the way I'm constructing the rest of the paper here. So first looking at the idea of blame, so this direct and indirect vilification of Muslims in news stories. And it begins not with what might just kind of the mainstream or legacy news media, but we look at this piece in the conversation from Imran Awan, looking at conspiracy theories, fake videos coming from Islamophobia, from alternate media. So sort of social media sites, he refers in there to Tommy Robinson News, which is, many of us kind of immediately kind of toe curl at the idea of a Tommy Robinson News with all capital letters, but this is on one of these channels, Telegram, speaking to a select community and sharing news stories that are, sometimes damaging. But what's important is that these social media accounts then become fodder that the mainstream news media report on. So sometimes when we see reporting in the mainstream media, they're not necessarily repeating these as truth, but they're reporting on the fact that these alternative sites are repeating these what we might call fake news stories. And so that still spreads those stories out. And so an example of this is from CNN, which is not a UK news media outlet necessarily, but is reporting on England here. And the headline shows the latest sign of COVID-19 related racism. Muslims are being blamed for England's coronavirus outbreaks. And so this story came from last summer. We're just a couple months into the lockdown at that point, looking at Eid and religious holidays as sort of a super spreader events and wondering about the irresponsibility of community behavior that could lead to the spread of the virus. These are narratives that are being surfaced and that are being discussed, and not just by these sort of alternative media accounts, but also by politicians. So Chris Whitaker, who was a Tory MP, was fingering ethnic populations for not taking the pandemic seriously. And when journalists asked him to elaborate, do you mean Muslims? He says, of course. So you get also the sense about rumors regarding secret gatherings of Muslims during Ramadan, and that mosques are secretly open when they should be closed. So these are the narratives that the reporter is surfacing. So they say it's not that they are reporting that these things necessarily happening, but reporting on the rumors, and that pushes those out. So those are some indirect stories about the vilification that come. I want to highlight as well work that MEND did. MEND is a social activist group that looks at Islamophobia and also does a fair amount of media monitoring. And they they looked at coverage kind of about 2 months into the pandemic and the lockdown, and their page here has some reference to the same rumors that are discussed in the CNN piece, but more interesting for them is looking at the indirect responsibility. And a trend that they observed was this association of Islam with the pandemic through visual imagery. And they give a long battery of stories that are discussing COVID lockdown concerns in a general way, but attaching images, especially of Muslim women, visibly Muslim women in UK streetscapes, and wondering what the purpose is of this. I remember reading sort of caustic observers saying, look, we want a representation in your papers, but not like this. Why are we linking this visual image with this story in a general way about this health concern in the UK? They note in their report this in no way is a definitive indication of a pattern of Islamophobia. So stepping back from what the headline maybe is kind of suggesting of this report. But they do talk about a need for journalists and editors to be equipped with religious literacy in order to fully understand the impacts of such depictions of minority communities. So this is the blame narrative sort of in that early days of the pandemic, which, as we'll note, kind of came in March, and then you had Ramadan about a month following, and so that was fused there. Later on, we then get this worries about the variants coming through, and this Indian variant. So once again, we have stories of community from travel from South Asia, and how these ideas then get imported here. And you see some of the headline at the bottom very much links another concern, which I want to talk about, which is vaccine hesitancy that could be behind the rise of the Indian COVID variant. So once again, the Muslim community is seen as one that is bespoke and peculiar in terms of concerns about taking vaccines when everyone else is, which the everyone else is not itself an obvious question, but how the news media are pitching it, so where they're identifying problems and blame. This website is probably worth a study in and of itself. This is from the British Islamic Medical Association, and they were active in spreading information about the vaccine and the virus, and basically kept a running tally on this webpage of news stories that they've been involved in. So it's not an exhaustive list of stories that concern Muslims and COVID, but good to look through and see the emergence of themes. First is, are vaccines halal? Which vaccines have been approved and are they appropriate? Then stories that are encouraging community take-up of the vaccine, the idea of countering misinformation or propaganda. And I think that the subhead you see there about myth busting, as seeing that the purpose of the site, speaks a lot to some of the themes and the efforts that this group and other groups were a part of. Later, we get the idea that the vaccine would not break the Ramadan fast, and also a few stories about mosques as vaccination centers, which I'll come back to towards the end of the presentation. So the next broad category is that of suffering, and I mentioned this is sort of the flip side of vilification, because often some of the ideas that are related to stories about blaming Muslims, we say, well, okay, you could talk about them being responsible, you could talk about them being vulnerable to these patterns. And so this is from that same CNN story that was looking at the concerns, and you see that in this paragraph here, the discussion about the real vulnerabilities that Muslims do face, and so building that social agenda into a story that is reporting notionally on rumors of Islamophobia and that blame story, and put as well in this headline by the Middle East Eye that British Muslims in the eye of the pandemic storm once again, and looking at both the demographic difficulties that the community faces, intergenerational home dwellings, but also the economic disadvantage, the idea of frontline workers. The story references taxi drivers and healthcare workers specifically, but we can also think about people doing food delivery and working in grocery stores. So the communities that didn't have the choice not to be meeting the public throughout and are at risk and are suffering at a greater extent. This story is dealing, I want to think about women and their vulnerability, in particular Muslim women. This story was an interesting one that we saw a few other places as well, about the face masks that might change social attitudes concerning women who wear the niqab. I had a student doing an undergraduate dissertation on that this year, found that to be an interesting question, looking into those double standards perhaps, but that is less common than this, which is, for example, Reuters, the news agency, felt the need to do a fact check. Once again, we see a mainstream outlet countering narratives emerging in alternative media spaces. But here we see this strange, convoluted double negative headline: high COVID-19 rates in countries where women wear niqabs don't prove face coverings are ineffective. So you get this don't prove an ineffective, very confused message to get out, but it gets a sense of what the target of the article is. It's not necessarily making statements about the medical benefits or lack thereof of the niqab as a way of covering one's face and preventing the spread of the aerosols and the virus, but countering narratives suggesting and commandeering that story for its own purposes. So that was interesting to me, how that story came about. It's a rather short piece, but it shows another community being identified. This here is finally kind of if we think about suffering, the set of stories around the suffering of NHS workers is particular to pay attention to, and these stories reference what was sort of the first COVID deaths that we saw of NHS workers. It was noted that they were all themselves identifying as Muslim. This story I recall hearing on mainstream news outlets, but when I'm searching, a year later to find images of this, interesting that the hits that came up were from the Muslim News and from Al Jazeera, so Muslim and Arab news outlets rather than the mainstream British ones. But it did also make stories like the Daily Mail when Prince Charles is doing something about this. This is regarding his video message at the beginning of Ramadan 2020 and identifying the deaths of the NHS workers. So this idea of sacrifice as a part of that. Last theme to carry here is that idea of helping, and here we see sort of the active and positive contributions that Muslims are making in Britain, and these stories of I would say the news media hearing the critique from scholars on representation are maybe working at trying to deepen and diversify the representations they have. So these fit as well in a pattern, I think, of stories that are, we see the good news stories coming out. But just to begin where the last one left off with the death of these NHS workers, to note that there are NHS workers, a theme that comes through is that the NHS actually relies on people who... I've just been muted. Are you hearing me again? All well? So that idea of the NHS worker as hero and British Muslims as part of that. We also have the stories of using these workers to encourage Muslims to vaccinate. So as the vaccines are rolling out, they are using their position and their social role to say, we'd like to see members take part of this. And then also there are stories about suffering Islamophobia, either from patients or from coworkers. Even Huffington Post had some stories around this. But what that is showing is that they are working in the space, that they are a part of the people who are working to help Britain. This also talks then about mosques. This is my last real point, sort of mosques as vaccination centers. And there are stories you see here about just the mere fact of that being on the panoply, which is a way to, tell stories about British Muslims in the mix. So, from various locations, but also that it becomes direct to issues that are confronting Muslims. So this story from February in Al Jazeera is looking at the idea of having mosque vaccination centers as a way of perhaps bridging some of the concerns, vaccine hesitancy, if you will, or distrust of authorities, and making it a space that can encourage more uptake of vaccination in Muslim populations. And here from the Leicester Mercury story that even using Ramadan as an occasion to highlight that this is acceptable, according to many scholars, during Ramadan. It doesn't break one's fast to get this, and so having a clinic in a mosque during Ramadan is a way of really sort of symbolizing that. So those are, I think, the narratives that emerge for me through, I say, a very surface, a very pocket look at what's going on here. I will wrap up on this with a Diolch yn fawr, and when we turn to the question and answer session, happy to take questions on this as best I can.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent paper. And I've certainly got questions, and in particular, I'd like to, think with you whether, the kind of media outlet, whether there were any patterns between the kind of media outlet and the theme, sort of their, coverage of Islam and COVID sort of came together. But I'll leave that question for the end. So thank you, Michael, staying to time. Brilliant, thought-provoking paper. Colleagues, as usual, if you've got questions, please hold them till such, for the last 20 minutes when we can take them, together with questions for all speakers. So thank you, Michael, very much indeed.